and sort of why it exists. I'll talk a little bit about the history of the database and where we're heading in the future, sort of our plans for the next few years. And I finally want to talk about something that's very close to my heart at the moment, which is the Geochemistry Initiative, which I'll talk about later. But before I start, I thought I'd just add a little bit of context about what my background is, because as Xiangzhou just introduced me, I am still quite new to this field as well. I joined this project a year ago, and before that I was in sort of geodynamics, observational geodynamics. So I'm a geochemist and a geophysicist somewhere, and using the composition of volcanic rocks to learn something about upper mantle processes, and specifically looking at Neogene Cenozoic volcanism, intraplate volcanism across the world, to try and understand upper mantle dynamics. Just briefly, so that you know that I do come from a research and data background as well. So I'm going to jump straight in, and I'll keep this introduction quite brief, because I think most of you have heard about GEOROC and know what it is. But just starting from first principles, so we're all on the same page. GEOROC stands for the Geochemistry of Rocks of the Oceans and Continents. So it's a database compiling geochemical compositions of rocks. And that is mostly volcanic and igneous rocks, but also extends to other rock types. And sort of in your normal, and say an average sort of research cycle in the field of geochemistry would start with, you go into the field, you collect a sample, a rock, you go back to your home institution, analyze it in the lab, and produce a table of analytical measurements, chemical measurements, that you then publish in a paper. And most of the time that's where it stops. But this is where then the GEOROC database comes in, where we're essentially compiling many of these data tables from different publications and compiling them all in one global database to make these different data sets from different publications easier to find and compare with each other, essentially. So the actual data that's compiled in GEOROC is literally anything you could measure in lab on a rock. So it's pretty much all of the elements in the periodic table. We're looking at major trace elements, isotopic ratios, analytical ages as well of rocks, glasses, minerals, and their inclusions. I've already said there's a focus on volcanic rocks, which is sort of has a historical reason, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But it's in theory and principle suited to all solid earth rock samples. The important thing is it is exclusively compiled from the published literature, so every single data value in GEOROC is associated with a publication and a reference. And the earliest samples collected in the database are from 1883, and it's continuously updated today. So along with these sort of primary data, the chemical compositions, we also collect a number of other additional information or metadata. That starts with the information about the publication that is linked to this data set. So what paper it is, who the authors are, etc. Then sample description. So where did the sample come from? What type of sample is it? What rock or mineral, etc. And then very importantly, information on the analytical methods. So what instrument was used, what type of analyses were done, what are the uncertainties associated with that. And then for isotopic measurements in particular, we're also recording normalization and fractionation correction values. And again, I like to say this many times, we can only report in the database what is reported in the publications. So if a paper doesn't say where the sample comes from or what instrument they use to analyze a particular measurement, then we can't record it in GEOROC. So GEOROC as a database and a compilation is only as good as the publications that go into it. This is important to keep in mind. Just to show you what that looks like in terms of numbers, at present day, well, I guess this is a few months half a year ago now. There are over 30 million individual data values in GEOROC, coming from over 20,000 individual publications. So these are quite large numbers. More than half of that is actually mineral analyses in the blue colors here, mostly zircon analyses, CPX, olivine, etc. The rest is mostly made up of whole rock analyses, WR, which are dominated by basalt analyses. And that is, again, has a historical reason because the sort of the database started with ocean island basalt data and then expanded from that. Now, in terms of global distribution, the colors on this image don't really matter so much, but these are all individual samples recorded in the GEOROC database. So you can see that we have samples from every corner of the world, more or less, and any gaps in the sort of sample coverage, say in South America here, or maybe Greenland is an obvious one. These are not necessarily problems with the data compilation efforts, but they're more sort of actually reflecting sampling, true sampling bias of where you can actually access rock samples from. Maybe also note the oceans, the mid-ocean ridges are not compiled in GEOROC. There's a separate database for mid-ocean ridge data, just called PETDB. Quick word on why is this interesting? I'm sure you've all got, at least you can think of one example of why this compilation work might be interesting and what it can be used for. I just want to showcase a few sort of examples of what GEOROC data is used for and has been used for in the past. My first example is I think it's the first publication ever that used GEOROC data. In fact, actually published before GEOROC existed, by Al Hoffman, who compiled a whole lot of ocean island basalt data along with sort of average continental and crust and sedimentary compositions. And based on that data compilation, he could sort of distinguish that there are very different chemical signatures between basaltic oceanic crust and continental crust. And from that, you can then make inferences about the sort of the formation of the Earth and sort of planetary processes. I think that's a fairly straightforward example, but this is where it all started. My next example is already using a lot more data compilations from 2015. And you can see this is a very noisy data set. What it shows doesn't matter so much, but the point I want to make here is that if you looked at any one of these data points, or even a subset of them, you probably wouldn't be able to tell very much. But by looking at a large compilation of many sort of values, data points globally, you can try and make out certain global trends. In this case, linking trace element signatures of arc magmas to crustal thickness, which in turn can be linked to has been linked to copper enrichment, which then has economic potential for exploration purposes. Now, this is an example that you might remember from a webinar a few months ago, work done by Patrick Ball to link intraplate volcanic compositions to geophysical parameters, in this case, shear wave velocities, but also lithospheric thickness, and essentially combining a global data set compilation from GEOROC of volcanic compositional data with geophysical and other constraints to look at upper mantle dynamics and the sort of the temperature of the top part of the Earth. And my final example, you are probably also very familiar with, because it's come from one of yours, looking again using a GEOROC compilation of xenolith data, in this case, planoproxene compositions worldwide to try and work out the level of metasomatism in the continental crust, mostly continental crust. And these are all examples from within the earth sciences, but there's actually also a number of other applications in different disciplines. So there are applications in archaeology, archaeometry, where you can use the sort of the trace element signature, for example, of ceramic to reconstruct trade routes, but also human migration routes. There's an application to soil contamination, soil sciences, geohealth is a fairly large application area, and also planetary exploration, sort of spectral analyses, both on Earth but also other planets. And there are many more applications and examples. There are over 3,000, I think, citations to GEOROC data. So many of those will be within the earth sciences, but there are certainly a bunch of applications elsewhere. I just put this slide in to sort of remind you that even though we're dealing with strictly geochemical data, that data has impact and sort of implications for a range of really quite important aspects of life on Earth. And the United Nations have defined these 17 sustainability goals, and geochemistry has a direct link to at least 6 of these, if not more. But I think that's all I want to say on that front. I think, well, I obviously think that GEOROC is very important, but I hope that you agree with me that even though it is potentially sort of a very domain-specific collection of data, it has huge impact and potential and applications in many, many disciplines across science, exploration, but also general society. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the history, just because that's, I think, important background information. I've alluded to this a couple of times. GEOROC has existed for over 20 years. First established in the late 90s at the Max Planck Institute in Mainz by Al Hoffman. And it started off as a collection of ocean island basalt compositions. I've already said that, but then quickly expanded to include other volcanic rocks, mostly from the continents, and also plutonic rocks and xenoliths. And present day, same numbers again. We've collected or compiled data from more than 20,000 individual publications, more than 600,000 samples, over 30 million individual data values in this database. And I guess one way of measuring the impact and sort of how well used this resource is in the community is to look at the traffic on our website. So this is just counting number of visits to the GEOROC website. And in light blue here are the sort of just pure visits, people who open the website, and that's somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 people a year. And that's fairly sort of steady number. It's increasing slightly in recent years. And then in dark blue, these columns show the downloads of data from GEOROC. And you can see that these are really rapidly increasing in previous year, sort of the most recent years, and has increased lots in the last couple of years. Part of that is just because, I guess, the community are more and more, ever more aware of GEOROC as a resource, so they're using it more, but it does actually also reflect the way in which GEOROC data are used. So initially it was mostly sort of for putting regional studies in a global context. So if you measure something in one particular volcanic province, you might say, okay, and this is roughly equivalent to the value seen across the globe. It was also used for teaching a lot, still is used for teaching a lot as a resource. But then increasingly in the last 5 years or so, people are doing much more sophisticated sort of statistical computational analyses with large data sets. And these are some of the examples I showed you earlier, where increasingly our customers come and want to download pretty much the entire GEOROC database and then continue and do more research with that huge data set. I think that's all I wanted to say here. That sort of this increase in downloads reflects that people are more and more interested in actually using large compiled data sets and then doing further analyses on those. Sort of just a fun little exercise I did at some point was looking at, on the left, the contribution of different journals to data held within GEOROC. So these are the journals where the papers are published that contribute data to GEOROC. And these are your standard geochemical journals, really. And on the right are the papers, or the publishers, the journals where papers citing GEOROC data are published. And on first glance, that looks fairly similar. So you see Lithos as the clear winner on both sides. But if you look a bit closer on the right-hand side, you see slightly different disciplines cropping up. So geophysics, geodynamics, computational journals are coming in here. And that is just to sort of, show that the people who use GEOROC data aren't necessarily the ones who produce the data. I have a map as well showing where the people who visit the GEOROC website come from, and the sort of, I guess, the most obvious use cases are Germany, where the database is hosted. The US are sort of heavy users, and China recently, especially in the last 5 years or so, China has really come up as a user base. But the other interesting fact on this map is actually that there are very few countries on this map that aren't blue. So actually there are very few countries in the world that don't use GEOROC as a resource at all. So that's always encouraging for us to see. Just to come back to the history briefly, right from the beginning, GEOROC collaborated really closely with a sort of sister database, PetDB, which is hosted at Lamont, Columbia University in New York. And these two databases were actually pretty much designed and thought of at the same time independently, where PetDB then focused on mid-ocean ridge basalts, whereas GEOROC was more the sort of the ocean islands and then continental samples. And they decided to work together and sort of collaborate closely, design, like sit down together and decide how should we structure and store the data, what's the data model, what vocabulary should we use, what words to describe certain terms and concepts within the database. And then in 2006, EarthChem was formed, which is a platform essentially that provides a single point of access to 6 currently distinct databases across the world. So GEOROC, since 2006, GEOROC data has been available through the EarthChem platform, as well as through the GEOROC website itself. And then, unfortunately, by 2017 or so, the sort of, as collaborations go with time, they sort of diverged a little bit, and the IT infrastructure behind GEOROC essentially just couldn't keep up with EarthChem anymore. So EarthChem managed to secure additional funding to sort of upgrade their systems, whereas GEOROC was still on the status of 20 years ago. So at some point, there's still collaboration, but the sort of the seamless data exchange is no longer seamless. So this is where I come in and where the DIGITS project comes in. So last year, GEOROC was moved from the Max Planck Institute to the University of Göttingen, so still within Germany, but different host institution, different funding, different sort of background to the infrastructure. And as part of this move, we have a lot of plans for GEOROC. some of which are summarized on this image. But essentially, it's the sort of the main task is just to make sure that GEOROC continues to exist, continues to be useful to the users, and is brought up to date to sort of modern standards. And a lot of that centers on the FAIR data principles, which you may have heard about. They're becoming more and more omnipresent in recent months and years. And essentially the saying, just defining that data should be easy to find and access, reuse, but also interoperate, exchange between different data systems. So essentially what EarthChem was trying to, or is facilitating between the PETDB and GEOROC database, but on a global level. And I thought I'd talk a little bit about what that actually means. There's lots of colorful little tiles on here. I'll take you through them slowly and just highlight the important ones. So there are a number of these criteria that make up FAIR, so findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable, which GEOROC is already doing. So these are things that GEOROC from the beginning was designed to do. There is a lot of very rich metadata, additional information, sample description, and things like this, information on the analytical methods. It has always been completely free to access and relatively easy to access as well. There are controlled lists of vocabularies, so there are fixed terms of how you should call certain things, like a basalt versus an andesite, things like that. And the whole point of GEOROC is for the data to be reusable. So that is what the metadata are there for, but also sort of a very clear documentation of where each data point comes from. And there are a few other aspects which are partly included in GEOROC already, or are things that we're currently working on a lot. And that starts and sort of focuses on the persistent identifiers, which are things like DOIs, ORCIDs. You might have heard of IGSNs. So they're sort of unique identifiers for objects, digital and physical. So a DOI is a unique identifier that will always point you to the paper, whereas an ORCID is a unique identifier for a person. IGSN is a unique identifier for a sample. We are also, we've set up a repository just to index and data properly, make it more findable, make it more persistent in many ways, and a few other things. So what does that mean for GEOROC in particular? So I've just thought I'd sort of highlight the goals of the DIGIS project, which starts with a sort of new data model, so a new structure in which the data, the information is actually saved and accessed and stored. And we're using, the goal behind this is to make it more interoperable, to make it easier to exchange data between the GEOROC database and PETDB and other databases around the world. And we're heavily relying on these persistent identifiers, and where there are standards and sort of best practices for how things should be stored and described, we want to use those as well and implement them. The second aspect is the improving data entry. And there's two aspects to that. The one is sort of the actual, at the moment, all our data entry into GEOROC is done solely by GEOROC curators, and it's essentially manual labor. They go look through the journal lists of new publications, identify papers that are interesting, and then extract the data from these papers and add them into the database. So that's something that we can definitely streamline and optimize and sort of automate a little bit, so to automatically harvest data from PDFs or online publications, just to make the job easier for our curators. But the second aspect is also to actually allow users to upload their own data. And for that purpose, we've set up the repository so that the community can contribute to maintaining GEOROC. And the third big goal of our project is improving the access to data. So currently it's only through the website and the web interface. So we're improving that and making sure that's sort of up to modern standards and easy to use. And on top of that, we're also developing an API and essentially making the whole database machine readable, so that you can interface directly from a piece of code that you're writing rather than having to go through the website. All right, so these are all sort of the goals for the next few years. The project has been running for 1 year so far, so I just thought I'd highlight what we have achieved up to now. And the first point on here is actually just migrating the whole system from Mainz to Göttingen, which sounds a lot easier and simpler than it is in real terms, just because it is a piece of software and sort of functionality that is 20 years old. So carrying that across to a new host institution and making sure everything still works was actually quite a big challenge. But that's something we've now achieved. We've also got a prototype of our new data model. So we're now working on implementing that to actually improve the interoperability. And we're working very closely with EarthChem and PettyBee on this. We have set up a repository, and it's serving two functions. One is the data upload by users that I've already mentioned, and the other is actually also as to store the GEOROC pre-compiled files. So these are essentially compilations of GEOROC data that we make every time we release a new update of the database. And then people can download these compilations rather than having to query through the website. And they can sort of download a pre-compiled file and then work with that. And these files are now stored in our repository, which means they are version controlled. So if you download something cited in your paper as that version, somebody else can come and go to that exact version of the data set and reproduce your research. We are also re-establishing, that should be the data exchange with the EarthChem portal. So we've now updated GEOROC so far that we can send data to EarthChem. Again, they just have to implement it on their side now, but that is almost up to date again. And we've made some small fixes and improvements to the website. Right, this was all about me and us and GEOROC. What about you? There are certain things where you can help us. And the most important here really is point number one. If you publish data, please follow the community guidelines and sort of recommendations on how to publish your data, what information to include, what structure it should take, and where to publish it as well. If you can, use IGSNs. So these are the unique identifiers for samples, and they simply allow us to link data published across different publications, which if you just use a standard sample name, could be confused with other samples. And finally, I mean, I'm sure you're all aware that many journals are now actually requiring you to upload your data before you can submit or at least publish a manuscript. So when you're doing that, rather than submitting to any old repository just so that you can tick a box, it would actually be very helpful if you could submit your data to domain repositories. In the case of geochemistry, that would be the EarthChem library or now the GEOROC repository, because that way your data is findable. If you go and submit your data to Figshare or Mendeley data or whatever the other ones are, nobody will ever be able to find it again because there's just too much information on there and there's no good way to search through it. Whereas if it goes to a domain repository, it can reach the community that is interested in that data. So, and it will also alert us to the fact that this data exists, and then it can easily be integrated into the GEOROC database or FChem-PetDB. They've got the same system. Right. So I just wanted to finish on a few aspects of FAIR that we can't possibly do on our own. And these are in part the vocabularies, but it's really in the word of this last box down here, community standards. These are things that we can't decide on. How should data be reported? What is the best way to store and arrange and sort of make available geochemical data? This is something that has to be agreed by everybody within the global geochemistry community. And unfortunately, at the moment, there are no standards. Every group does something slightly different, and that leads to chaos at the sort of compilation end. So we have so far enforced our own standards, but they obviously don't actually match all of the needs of the community. So in order to improve that, we are part of the One Geochemistry Initiative, which was something set up by Kerstin Lehnert and Leslie Weiborn. I think the first time it was created was in 2018. And essentially, it's trying to connect different geochemical data systems across the world. And the important points here are that it's not a top-down deciding this is how things should be run, this is how data should be reported, but it's a collaboration and meant as a community effort. Just briefly on what standards actually means, what are the things that we do need to standardize? That is things like metadata schemas, which is essentially what additional information do you need to describe chemical data? What words should you use to describe these data? Persistent identifiers, how far should you use these or which ones might be necessary? And then certain protocols to make it machine readable as well as just human readable. The reason why these standards don't exist yet is domain specific in our case, unfortunately. The geochemistry community is really quite diverse, and there are very, very many different aspects to it, and it's actually very hard to get them all to agree on one way of doing things. So part of the challenges is just the diversity of data types and use types, applications. Another part is just that sort of data publication is sort of seen as the last step in the process. So usually people publish, well, the ultimate reward is the publication you get at the end, because that's what you get cited for, that's what you get credit for and a reward for. Whereas the data is sort of falls off the wagon somewhere on the side there. And often people are actually scared to share their data because then other people might scoop them, try and do similar research or sort of analyses and steal your ideas, steal your data. So these are the challenges we are facing, and that's actually quite difficult to overcome, but we are moving in the right direction. So as a community, I think things are happening, and One Geochemistry is really hoping to push this along and sort of to use the turn of the tide, as it were, to create something that is truly global. So at the moment, it's mostly dominated by sort of countries that fall into the global north. So the US, Europe, Australia, but it's designed to be something that is inclusive and equitable. It will help the data to be interdisciplinary and actually make it easier to have these applications in different disciplines and in different use cases. I think that's, yeah. So it's designed, so you can think of it as a set of Olympic rings where all of the different communities, all of the different parts of one community come together as equal partners working together. That's the idea. So as I said already, at the moment, we're a group of participants, mostly from the US, Europe, and Australia. We've just sort of constituted ourselves, published an interim governance, but we want to increase participation and are actively recruiting people from other countries, other systems, etc. And excitingly, we've just got funding for the next 2 years as part of the World Fair project, which is an EU-funded project led by CoData and the Research Data Alliance. And we, as Geochemistry, One Geochemistry, are just one of 11 use cases that are all trying to work out a way to essentially implement fair data globally in each of the disciplines. So we're one of 11, and the other case studies are really across the board interdisciplinary. So this is quite an exciting project. And if you're interested in this, I encourage you to go to a SciDataCon session that's happening next week, actually, on this. And yeah, just contact me or ask me if you want more information on that. Yeah, and with that, I'd like to finish and take your questions. Maybe just say again, we both at GEOROC and for One Geochemistry, we're always looking for participation and feedback. If there's anything you dislike, you don't understand, or you want to get involved in, please get in touch. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Marthe. Now, I have a question for our participants, so feel free to open your mic, ask a question, or you could type your question in the chat, and I'm going to read your question on your behalf.
First question is always hardest.
I'll go first then. Thanks for the talk, Marthe. It's very interesting. As for me, I'm not a geochemist actually, so full disclaimer, but I am interested in the data management aspect of this, and I think I can recognize when there's a lot of work involved, and this seems to be a very difficult undertaking. So I'm glad you guys are doing that. You basically answered most of the questions I had before the presentation, which are mainly how does the database interface with the community in terms of will they be able to upload and perhaps edit the database? Because I know, like, how many GEOROC curators are there at any given time?
1.5 at the moment.
Oh, 1.5. All right, yeah. So I can imagine it's a lot of work for you want 1.5 people. So I was wondering, like, is it feasible to have this be where it's not kind of in between, fully centralized, one person being the curator and full Wikipedia free for all, kind of somewhere in the middle where people are allowed to upload and edit the database with versioning through something like a pull request on GitHub. So, they say, I propose these edits to the database, and can someone from the community peer review it and check to make sure that it's consistent? And that way you can kind of distribute the editing of the database. It seems like kind of in line with what you're already planning.
That is exactly what we have in mind. It's just how to implement that is the challenge at the moment. But yeah, the hope is that we can let people at least submit new data, but also request for changes to data. And then I guess in the first instance, one of our curators would look at that and decide yes or no. But in the future, we might build up a set of sort of trusted community members who we would trust to make these quality decisions and sort of do the peer review that you were talking about.
Right.
yes, that is definitely something we need to do, because it's just there's so many papers and so much data published every year, and if it's all down to one or two people, it's impossible to keep up.
And I guess kind of related to that is there any way, I think you mentioned schema, like is there any way to I guess standardize a consistency check with the data, such that if someone wants to upload something, you can run some kind of automated script that checks whether or not all the identifiers are there, whether the data are the right precision or the right data type, those kinds of things?
So yes and no. At the moment, we are working with a particular input template, or well, actually we're sort of stealing that work from EarthChem, who put a lot of work into developing a template and then have a sort of editorial data extraction process linked to that. So we're following that same path. The problem is that there are only so many things you can check. So you can check if certain data types and sort of certain information is present at all. But in terms of actually checking whether it's good quality and sort of the right values, the right precision, that is trickier just because of how diverse the data types are. So depending on what you've measured, there's actually quite a sort of wide range of what you would need to consider it good data. And this is where all this work for developing sort of standards and best practices comes in, because we can't necessarily make that decision either. I mean, we as a curating team are looking at data management, data curation. We're not active in the research community anymore, and methods, especially geochemical analytical methods, change all the time and improve all the time. And we can't keep up with that change, and we can't possibly say this is good quality data, whereas this one isn't. That would be something that would have to come out of the community.
Right. Yeah, hopefully that community gets built up fairly quickly.
I mean, how we're operating at the moment is to invite feedback, and we do get emails semi-regularly saying, hey, I found a mistake in the database, please can you fix this typo? But also certain requests on, sometimes quality or things like that. But it's a lot of work of, I guess, the barrier, the activation energy of you spot something that might be wrong in GEOROC, and then actually contacting us is still quite large, because I mean, what is the benefit to that member of the community, that researcher, immediately?
Right.
We're trying to run a number of these sort of seminars like this, but also workshops at the major conferences, just to try and get the community a bit more on board and show that we are actively trying to change things and improve things, and ask for help.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, that's Brian Real from Zhejiang University. So next question is from Xiaochun Dong, and this question is about extraction data from published journals. So does the data being extracted manually, or they are by computers aided by the natural language processing technology?
At the moment, it's all completely manual, but that is something we're working on at the moment. So we've got two PhD students actually part of the project who are looking, or are meant to be looking at, natural language processing, but also other means of data harvesting, and sort of using more semantic tools. And the challenge here is finding the data that's in a data table is easy, but quite a lot of the metadata, the additional information, is hidden somewhere in the text. And as somebody who reads these papers regularly, you know where to look in terms of where will it tell me which instrument was used and what the sort of the precision values for that particular analysis are. But a computer wouldn't necessarily know where to find these things, or even what keywords to search for. So that's something we're actively developing. Hopefully it will, I think we'll never be able to automate it fully, but at least make it easier for the curators. But if you have any ideas, we're very interested to hear them.
So Matt, asking a following question. that how many people were hired before for this manually data logging process for this 20,000 publication, like 3,000 or 20,000 publication database so far?
Yeah, so this is part of the historical aspect that initially when it started, I think it was a group of 6 curators or so. But then at the Max Planck Institute, they were supported as a group, but whenever somebody left because they retired or went elsewhere, they didn't get replaced. So over the years, the group got smaller and smaller, and the last original curator of GEOROC retired in March this year. So that's sort of part of the background of why the database had to move in the first instance. And now we've just got the problem that we do need to attract essentially competitive research funding, and most of the research funders will fund cutting edge new science, new developments. They won't fund somebody who's extracting data from publications, and the maintenance of the infrastructure is just much harder to fund, unfortunately. So that's why at the moment we're running on, I guess, it's even less than 1.5 full people in terms of time. And it's likely to get worse, which is why we need to engage the community more and sort of have these data entry options.
Okay, thank you. And the next question is from Liang. So question is about PATDB and GEOROC. So they do have some overlapping data that are the same. So how could we distinguish their repeated data from these two data sets?
Very good question. Yes, there is some overlap, although it's actually not as large as you would think, just because essentially PATDB and GEOROC divided up the world between them initially, and sort of then repeatedly throughout over the years. Initially, it was PATDB just as mid-ocean ridges and everything roughly below seawater, below the water, sea level in the oceans, whereas GEOROC does ocean island basalts and continental regions. But then, of course, there are certain publications that's all entered by paper. So if there is a paper that has some analyses from Iceland, say, and there will be some that are on Iceland itself above water, but then it also has some analyses from the ridge, then where does it go? And I guess traditionally it would have been entered in both places. In theory, you should be able to find those duplicates quite easily using the paper ID. I mean, that is always stored, so you can just find if the same paper is entered twice. The other thing that would be really useful for this is the IGSN. So if you uniquely identify which sample has been analyzed and entered, then that should be easy enough to find out again as well. But there are other aspects of it which are sort of, well, PATDB, GEOROC might have slightly different criteria, standards for how they enter the data. So the actual metadata, like the additional information that comes along with that is entered for any one publication might be slightly different. And I guess from our perspective, it's a huge waste of resources and energy because we have to enter things twice. So that's something we are also currently working on. We're talking to them very closely in terms of if there is, so we've redivided the world for the moment, and if there are any sort of papers where we're not sure who should enter it, we talk to each other and be like, do you want it or should we do it? And we're also making sure that we are using the same templates for data entry and sort of having the same quality criteria so that it doesn't matter in the end where it got entered, whether it's GEOROC data or PATDB data. Shouldn't matter in the end. And as long as you can access it all through the EarthChem portal, hopefully it should be the same quality and there shouldn't be any further duplicates. Does that answer the question?
Okay. Next question, please.
So we did actually think about, can we build in a filter of how to filter out these duplicates, which, as I said, should be fairly simple to do if you just go by the reference, the publication data. But then we'd also have to look at the like what information was entered for that reference, and if that is different, how do you choose which one you use? So in the end, for now, we've decided that we won't do anything, and it's few enough publications that, well, for now we're leaving that up to the users to decide which value they want to use.
Okay, you would have no more questions, then let's end the webinar today. So thanks everyone for your participation, and thanks our speaker again, Marthe, for your great talk. Okay, have a good evening, everyone. Good afternoon, and see you next week for the webinar. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much. Bye.